T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down.
On a chilly morning in Cape Canaveral, Florida, 7 men and women unknowingly boarded a flying explosive as they entered the cabin of NASA's Space Shuttle Challenger. These people, known as the Challenger 7, were all anticipating the most spectacular voyage of their lives. Inexplicably, their trip ended in tragedy just seconds after liftoff. Millions around the world, including the families of the astronauts, watched in silence as the 7 met their deaths in a ball of fire. NASA scrambled to find answers as the world mourned this tragedy. If NASA executives had only listened to the recommendation of their engineers, this tragedy may never have happened. Despite the deaths of these brave people, NASA brought triumph out of the tragedy by making many advancements in technology and scientific research, while the families of the astronauts turned their personal grief into community action.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
The Challenger 7 consisted of pilots Francis Scobie and Michael Smith, engineers Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Gregory Jarvis, physicist Ronald McNair, and the woman who was supposed to be the first ever teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe. This launch drew more interest than previous launches because McAuliffe was to be the first average American in space. According to Suzanne Lawrence's The Space Shuttle Challenger Disaster, the Challenger's last mission was originally supposed to take place in July 1985. However, after many delays, the launch was rescheduled for January of 1986. At 7:30 a.m. on January 28, 1986, the Challenger 7 were briefed on the weather, though they were not informed of the dangers of launching at the current air temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit. In his book, Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, Alan McDonald, who was working at the solid rocket booster for the launch, said on that morning, an ice crew was sent to inspect the shuttle. Quote, Charlie Stevenson, head of the ICE team, told Horace Lamberth, NASA Director of Engineering at KSC, that based upon what he could see, the only choice you got today is not to go. Unfortunately, McDonald also said that no one told NASA leaders specifically that the O-rings could not withstand the harsh temperatures. Commander Francis Scobie had the final word on whether or not the shuttle would launch that day, but tragically, he was not informed of the dangers of launching at such low temperatures. He was excited and was heard saying, quote, my kind of weather, what a great day for flying. With that, Scobie led his crew out of the building and towards a van that would transport the astronauts to the Challenger. When launch time came at 11:38, millions were watching. People had gathered in the Kennedy Space Center grandstands, in their homes, and in schools where children were watching from their classrooms. Krista McAuliffe's parents were in the stands when the Challenger took off, crying tears of pride and joy. For the first minute of the launch, things were going as planned. However, at T+1 minute 13 seconds, the Challenger exploded, silencing the cheering crowds.
And you haven't seen probably much of what's been going on TV across the country today. But it's been a national day of tragedy, I can guarantee you that. You'll see that when you finally get out of here this evening. All America is sharing in the tragedy that you have lived through here today.
When the Challenger exploded, Ronald Reagan was in a briefing about an upcoming meeting with the media. Vice President George Bush and Chief of Staff Ronald Reagan walked in to inform the president of what had transpired. That day, Reagan wrote in his diary, quote, in came Poindexter and the VP with the news. We all then headed for a TV and saw the explosion replayed. There is no way to describe our shock and horror.
Painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
On February 6th, a presidential commission charged with investigating the explosion of the Challenger was sworn in. Over the next 4 months, the commission investigated the cause of the disaster, ultimately determining that a defective $900 rubber O-ring brought down the billion-dollar spacecraft. The manufacturer of these O-rings, Morton Thiokol, as well as NASA engineers, had previously expressed their concerns about the O-ring's sealing capability at temperatures below freezing. In the report, the Commission stated, quote, "The consensus of the Commission is that the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger was caused by a failure in the joint between the two lower segments of the right solid rocket motor, and the destruction of the seals that are intended to prevent hot gases from leaking through the joint during the propellant burn of the rocket motor." Later in the report, the Commission states that, quote, "O-ring resiliency is directly related to its temperature. A compressed O-ring at 75 degrees Fahrenheit is 5 times more responsive in returning to its uncompressed shape than a cold O-ring at 30 degrees Fahrenheit. This evidence shows that NASA executives should have heeded the warning of their own engineers when it came to the matter of launching the Challenger. The 7-degree temperature of the O-ring at launch time was a fraction of the safe temperature of 75 degrees. The Commission pinned the tragedy to NASA, saying, quote, "The decision to launch the Challenger was flawed. Those who made that decision were unaware of the recent history of problems concerning the O-rings, and were unaware of the initially written recommendation of the contractor advising against the launch at temperatures below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. If the decision makers had known all the facts, it is highly unlikely that they would have decided to launch 51L on January 28, 1986. The Challenger disaster caused NASA's launch plans to be set back almost 3 years, while the accident was investigated and the space shuttle was re-engineered to be safer than before. NASA's re-engineered space shuttle triumphantly completed its first successful mission since 1986, when the Discovery landed in October 1988. Along with their redesign of the shuttles, NASA adopted a less rigorous launch schedule. In 1985, NASA launched shuttles 9 different times, while in 1989, NASA only had 5 shuttle launches. While overcoming the tragedy of the Space Shuttle Challenger, NASA accomplished many scientific and technological advancements through the shuttle program. Missions helped build and maintain the International Space Station, launched the Hubble Space Telescope, applied radar topography to map the Earth's surface with 30 times more detail than before, and for almost 3 decades provided reliable, reusable human access to space. June Scobie, the widow of Commander Francis Scobie, helped start the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, which is used to educate middle schoolers in STEM-based learning centers. In her book, Silver Linings, Mrs. Scobie states, quote, "Tragedy can be a springboard to defeat or triumph. That helped me to overcome the tragedy of losing the Challenger crew, helped me lead the nation to create something positive, to redirect the energy used for grief and anger into a triumph for our nation and create Challenger Center. Today, Challenger Center is a thriving science, technology, engineering, and math education organization that reaches 250,000 students around the globe every year." The National Science Board commented on the Challenger Center's efforts, saying, quote, "The fact that their learning experiences remain current, changing and growing with trends, demonstrates their commitment to the mission and to those they continue to serve, one student at a time. While none of these accomplishments bring back the lives lost, it does bring some triumph from the tragedy." The Challenger disaster truly was a tragic incident. The entire country felt the loss of the brave men and women who died on that shuttle. NASA felt the consequence of their flawed decision to launch the Challenger in January 1986. They lost billions of dollars, 6 astronauts, and the first teacher in space because they would not listen to the warnings of their engineers. However, NASA has triumphed over this tragedy since 1986 with their scientific and technological advancements in space and on Earth, and the families of the Challenger crew have quieted their grief through the efforts with the Challenger Center. Senator and former astronaut John Glenn summed it up when he spoke at Judith Resnick's memorial service, saying, quote, "We try and we triumph. We try again and triumph again. And we try again, and our exultations know no bounds, for we triumph again and again. And then, we are human. We are not perfect. We are fallible. Tragedy pays the price for triumph. It has ever been thus." Let's never forget the last words that came from that spacecraft. "Go at throttle up." Those are far more than a courageous epitaph. They are America's history. They are America's destiny, and they will turn tragedy into triumph once again.